And for the semester student, he was a sure member for the University of Sydney from 2012 to 2014. And so he used his knowledge in the MSA legacy, and gave a lot of talks for Muslims all around Sydney. And he's also a teacher at Hadith Sciences. So he studied with a number of renowned Hadith specialists such as Dr. Tariq, Dr. Hassan Haidar, Dr. Isam, and Dr. Ra'ad, and others, and acquired a number of ijazat to teach the sciences of Hadith in various classical texts surrounding Hadith and its related disciplines. So with that in mind, inshallah, we have a very knowledgeable speaker, much to benefit from, and I'll give the cue to Brother Suved.
الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you for joining this session and learning about a very important and increasingly important topic, particularly sort of now as more and more hadith are under scrutiny, more and more discussions around what is authentic, what's not authentic, and the integrity of the sunnah as a corpus of religious instruction is being more and more scrutinized, and we're kind of being socialized and pressurized into being more flexible in what we can what we can accept, what we're willing to accept from the sunnah and what we're not. So what I aim to sort of do today is give a very quick sort of summary as to how hadith was preserved, right? So, and the primary objective here, I think, would be for us, well, in my sort of objective here would be to imbue a sense of confidence into the sunnah and the rigorousness with which it was preserved, so that when we say, for example, this hadith is in Bukhari, this hadith is in Abi Dawood, this hadith is in Musnad Imam Ahmad, we appreciate the effort that went into that and the standard of rigor and the standard of, I suppose, authenticity that was expended to make sure that hadith come to us as accurately as possible. Okay. With that in mind, though, a couple of things I want to point out. Firstly, this will probably be a bit shorter than the 2 hours. Reason being is because normally, in sort of preparing for this, I realized that it's like you can't do it in 2 hours, right? If you go on, for example, YouTube and you look at this history of hadith or similar sort of courses, it's at least 6-7 hours, 8-9 hours, right, minimum. So it either needs 8-9 hours to cover at a brief level, or it needs a number of months, right? And that's why there's a number of books that have been authored on this subject. Nonetheless, I think what I'll try to do is I'll leave out as many of the details as possible and try to give you like as bird's eye view of how this science was preserved as possible. All right, so that's the first sort of caveat. The second one was that when we say the history of the compilation of hadith, right, or the preservation of hadith, what we mean by that can refer to a number of different things, right? Because when we say hadith, that's a massive field, right? And Abu al-Hasan Nadwi, one of the great scholars of the last century, he said that if you look at the entire effort of scholarship, right, throughout history, vast majority of it was focused in hadith. Right, the vast majority of the scholarly effort was directed towards the pursuit of hadith, right? So obviously it's going to have a number of different components, right? And what we would call a jaza, right? A number of different parts. So when sort of someone says the preservation of hadith or the history of hadith, we can be talking about a whole host of different components of hadith, right? So, for example, I could give, there's sort of, it could be a history of the science of hadith, right? Which has its own history, right? Which has its own scholars that specialize in that, has its own books that have been written across multiple volumes, just in the principles of hadith, right? What do I mean by principles of hadith? It's what is the definition of a sahih hadith, right? What are the definitions of those definitions, right? When can we accept the hadith? When do we reject it? When must we reject it? When must we accept it? Right? What does this term mean? What does that term mean? Whose commentary in the hadith do we actually take into consideration, and whose commentary do we read? That's all that sort of stuff is the science of hadith called usul al-hadith, right? And that has its own sort of history. Then you've got the science of compilations of hadith, right? Specifically the way books were written, right? So there's, like when we say books of hadith, there are a number of different types, right? In fact, according to Sheikh Muhammad Ja'far al-Kattani, who was possibly the most significant scholar of the 20th century, a Moroccan scholar, he wrote a book called Ar-Risalatul Mustatfara, which is it's printed in about 800 pages. And its purpose was to serve as a index of the books that have been written specifically in hadith, right? And he collects around 1,200 books that have been written to serve the sciences of hadith. And then he says in the introduction to that book that I've collected only the most important, right? Only those books which a true muhaddith must have read and be cognizant of, right? And it's 1,200 books. And one of the contemporary scholars today, Hatim al-Awni, he taught that book online, and he said, when he was explaining this part, he said, it's a qatra, it's a mere drop in the ocean of the books that have been written in this science. And he says, وَأَقُولُ بِذَلِكَ بِدُونِ الْمُبَالَغَةِ, that I say this without any exaggeration, right? And that's certainly what appears to be the case for me as well in my cursory survey of the science. So that the books that have been written in the science of hadith have its own history, right? Likewise, hadith criticism, right? And by that, I don't mean we criticize hadith. I mean, how do we verify the authenticity of the hadith? What sciences are taken into consideration? That itself has its own history, right? So that's a point to keep in mind, that when we say the preservation of hadith or the history of hadith, we're talking about a multifaceted endeavor, right? A multi-century and a multifaceted endeavor to preserve the multiple composites which end up forming the whole, which is hadith here, right? So what I'm going to illustrate today is basically the history of the preservation, or basically what I'm going to talk about today is the subject of tadween al-hadith, right? The documentation of hadith, right? Which is, out of all those sort of different ways you could talk about the history of hadith are concerned, what I'm talking about is possibly an amalgamation of what all of these little composites were trying to achieve, right? So when we say hadith, what do we mean by hadith? We mean anything that Rasulullah ﷺ said, did, or approved of, right? And we also mean his characteristics. What did he look like, ﷺ? How did he used to behave? What did he own, right? That comes under the topic of Shama'il al-Muhammadiyya. So we're also interested in that, right? And also his adab and his history and all that sort of stuff as well, right? So these 5 things, his sayings, a hadith, right? That Rasulullah ﷺ said, XYZ hadith, right? That, his actions, what he approved of, right? So he might have seen something happen in the marketplace and just walked off, right? And that contains legal value, right? Because of Rasulullah ﷺ. My mic changed for some reason.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a bit loud now.
Yep. Is the audio still coming through?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, no, it's better now. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
No worries. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. I might just change my headphones because these Bluetooth ones keep dropping its connection. Give me
All
2
good.
seconds.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. By the way, guys, if you have any questions, just message it, and Brother Safed can, inshallah, get back at it.
Okay. Is that, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. This shouldn't drop out. So I was saying, so that's what we mean when we say hadith. Those are the 5 components we're talking about. Now, how were those 5 components preserved? So that's at the broadest possible level I can comment on that question. That's what I'll be covering today. And I don't sort of intend to make this like some sort of formal presentation or anything like that. There's a small sort of cozy number of people here today. So, you know, feel free to chuck your questions in or, yep, could you please repeat point 5? Yeah, sure. So point 5, so we say khuluqihi wa khalqiyatihi. So what we mean by that is so the first is his adab, right? So how did he alayhi salam used to sit? How did he used to behave himself amongst other people? How did he walk? How did he talk? How did he, you know, like his general day-to-day activities, how did he go about doing them? That's what we mean. And then the other one is wa khalqiyah, like his actual physique, his actual sort of body, right? We're also interested in that. What color was his hair? How was his eyes? How was his sort of build? How tall was he? All those kinds of things, right? Because and we've actually preserved that in a phenomenal amount of detail, incredible amount of detail, right? Right down to were there gaps in his teeth or not, right? Or that all these sorts of little minutiae have been preserved in intimate detail. So we're also interested in that because why? Because Rasulullah alayhi salam for us is not just a legal commentator, right? He's an object of love for every Muslim, right? And we want to have some sort of conception of and some sort of faculty to imagine Rasulullah alayhi salam, right? Side point here, actually, interestingly, it's probably worth. Every Muslim has the ambition to see Rasulullah alayhi salam in their dreams, right? Everyone grows up, you know, hearing about how someone else saw them in their dreams. One of the best ways to actually make that happen is to study the life and the persona of Rasulullah alayhi salam. So I recommend, if you guys can, to study Shama'il at-Tirmidhi of Imam at-Tirmidhi. It's a book which basically summarizes this particular topic. His behavior, his what's called tasarrufat, the way he'd engage with people, and also his physical characteristics. Right? That's all covered in a book called Shama'il at-Tirmidhi. And it's one of the best ways to induce Rasulullah alayhi salam visiting you in your dreams. Anyway, so so when I say preservation of hadith, I'm talking about these 5 things at the broadest possible level, right? Okay, those are the caveats that I want to make quickly. So the subject is called Tadween as-Sunnah an-Nabawiyyah, right? The documentation or the codification of the prophetic Sunnah, right? Of Rasulullah alayhi salam. So this particular history has 3 major phases, right? You can probably add a 4th one as well, but you know, we'll look at that later. But 3 major phases or stages, what's called in Arabic marahil, right? The first one is called a talaqqi wa riwaya. A talaqqi wa riwaya. Talaqqi means to receive something, reception, right? So the reception of hadith wa riwayatiha, and it's narrating, right? So if I receive a hadith, if I was a sahabi, I wish, but if I was a sahabi and I received the hadith, how do I communicate that hadith to someone else? That's the riwayah, right? So talaqqi is the process of me observing or receiving the hadith from Rasulullah alayhi salam, if you're a sahabi, or from other sahaba as well, from other people. That's me getting the hadith. Riwayah is me transmitting that hadith, right? So the first stage, a talaqqi wa riwayah, this stage was concerned with, or this stage describes how the Sahaba took the hadith from Rasulullah alayhi salam and narrated it, both to other Sahaba and to the subsequent generations that came after the Sahaba. And this doesn't need too much sort of detail. It just has a couple of things to talk about, and then we can move on. The second stage is at-Tadween, right? At-Tadween. Tadween was basically it's a difficult sort of word to translate. I'm not sure if there's a direct English translation for it, but it basically describes the idea that it's like dumping information, right? I don't know if you guys used to do this or if I was just a bad student at uni, but when I was doing an assignment or something like that, or answering a particular essay question, I'll just open up a Word document and just Google that question And then anything of any use I came across, anything which seemed like it was remotely helpful, right? A Wikipedia article, some journal article, some blog, some YouTube video, some lecture, whatever. I just get it and I just dump it into that Word document, right? And then later I'd sift through it. I'd start going through it. I'd say, oh, that's useful. And I'd actually put that into my actual essay, right? And I'd say, no, that's rubbish. That's not useful. This is useful. And I'd start, sifting through and refining and actually engaging with the content, right? So tadween is the first part. Just you have a blank document, just dumping information in there that you think of might be of relevance, to later synthesize and later refine, and then produce something of academic quality or value, right? So that sort of describes, I mean, not so crude. That's probably a bit, they're not dumping like useless information. There's quality in there, there's substance in there, but it wasn't intended for circulation. It wasn't a refined sort of masterpiece, your final copy, right? It was like, you might consider it, for example, your draft essay before you actually refine it and put it into, I don't know what you guys use, but we used to use Turnitin, right? In our sort of interface at uni. So before you submit it, you might have a draft essay, right? Or some sort of like vague summary. That would be tadween, right? So this is what the early generation did. So that was the second stage, al-marhalat al-thaniya. The third stage was a tasnif, right? Tasnif, sannafa yusannifu means to write, right? Write with the with refinement, right? So tasnif would be you submitting your essay to the your tutor or whoever's marking the essay, and he's judging the quality of your work based on what you submit, right? That would be tasnif, right? So that's like Imam Bukhari. He's got his whole lifetime of travels, his books, tomes or volumes, and he synthesizes all of that into his Sahih. And he says, okay, Ummah, here you go. Here's my Sahih. What do you think? He synthesizes that into his book, Tariq al-Kabir. He says, here you go, Ummah, benefit from this book, right? And his other books as well. That's called tasnif. That's your final product, your final version, which you're putting into circulation. And that was the third stage, right? So let's talk briefly about at-talaqqi wa-riwaya, right? Talaqqi, so I was kind of told to try to look at some Orientalist criticisms and misconceptions and whatnot. I can't do that too much, obviously, because given the sort of cursory survey of this topic, but nonetheless, a very important one. And I think the main one is that, see, Orientalist criticisms of Hadith, what happened was, and this is really unfortunate, but what happened was when the Muslim world was sort of at the fall of the Khilafah, when it was colonized by various nation states, they took a lot of the manuscripts, like in fact most of the manuscripts that were scattered all across Egypt, Syria, Turkey. Turkey still has quite a few, but all these different places, and they brought them over to the West, right? So some of the greatest hubs and repositories of Arabic manuscripts of the classical texts lie in Berlin, in Germany, in UK, in France, etc. So to the point that the Arab scholars, the ones who publish books that we have today, they sometimes need to get their students to get them copies from the library in various libraries in UK, in Germany and whatnot, right? Or they go themselves to these places. So what happened was, all these sort of manuscripts, they were taken to various sort of countries in outside of the Muslim world, and that inspired a lot of study into Islam, right? A lot of non-Muslims who had an interest in studying Islam, they started getting very interested in these sciences. So they went and learned Arabic at a very advanced level, not very, but at a sufficient level. They started going through these sort of manuscripts, and Hadith was their major focus, right? And so there was one particular, let's say the bedrock of Orientalist criticism of Hadith was Goldizer, right? And his student Joseph Sark or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce his name. So he basically forms the majority, the reliance. He's the Bukhari of the Orientalists, right? As far as Hadith criticism is concerned. And what he said, his thesis was that Hadith can't be trusted because Rasulullah ﷺ said, don't write Hadith from me, only write Quran. And Hadith were written around 200 years after the death of Rasulullah ﷺ.
Therefore, hadith is suspect. How can you believe stuff about Rasulullah alayhi salam 2 centuries after his passing away alayhi salam? That doesn't make any sense. How do we do that? How do we make sense of that? Right? That was the essence of his criticism, which obviously is mistaken on a number of different counts, right? Which I'll come to explain soon. So I'll look at this briefly. There's what he does, and see the beauty of looking at the responses to these Orientalist criticisms is that the ulama like Mustafa al-A'zami or Sheikh Hamiduddin, who else is there? Sheikh Mustafa al-Sibai, all these scholars who responded to the Orientalists, they didn't even feel the need to produce new content. They just went back to the classical scholars and the answers were already there, right? So on this particular question, for example, Khatib Baghdadi has a book called Taqyidul Ilm, right? Taqyidul Ilm, which means the writing down of knowledge. And the book is about how you should write down knowledge and how you should take notes and whatnot. And the first chapter he mentioned in this book is to do with all of the hadith which say do not write down hadith, right? So the Orientalists, they had a field day. They're like, look at this. These are hadith which Bukhari and Abu Dawood and Ad-Daraqutni and At-Tirmidhi and Al-Hakim that they've produced, they can't be hadith because there's centuries of gaps. And the early Sahabah and Tabi'een, they didn't write hadith because the hadith says, don't write hadith from me, right? And look, Khatib Baghdadi, your own scholar, is saying this. So how can you Muslims base your entire faith on something that A, the early scholars didn't even write and were told not to write? B, even if they did write it, they're going against the direct command of Rasulullah alayhi salam. And C, it was written centuries after. How can you Muslims treat this with any degree of seriousness, right? Now, Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the Muhaddithin, they weren't shy of any of these things, right? Like I said, Khatib Baghdadi is himself broadcasting this. We have nothing to hide, right? It's everything is explained in extreme amount of detail. So, how do we deal with this hadith? The hadith is in Bukhari, right? It says, the hadith says Rasulullah alayhi salam said, لا تكتبوا عني غير القرآن. Don't write from me anything apart from the Quran. Right? Now, the first thing to point out is the glaring contradiction here. If you say the hadith is suspect because they were written 200 years after, you can't use a hadith to prove that point. You can't use a hadith to prove the point that hadith are suspect. That's circular, right? It's a paradox. So I can't say premise number one, hadith are not authentic and suspect. My proof for that is a hadith. That's a contradiction, right? You said that the logic doesn't work there. Nonetheless, out of all of the hadith that were written on this topic, that the Orientalists try to produce here, only one is authentic, right? Only one, which is the hadith I mentioned earlier. لا تكتب عني غير القرآن, right? That's the only hadith in this entire subject which is authentic. Even in this hadith, there's two opinions. One opinion says that this isn't actually a hadith. This is a statement of a Sahabi, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Right? This is a statement not of Rasulullah alayhi salam, but a statement of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. It's not a hadith. The second opinion says yes, it's a hadith, right? So Imam Muslim, rahimahullah in Sahih, he took the opinion that it's a hadith, but his teacher, Bukhari, said no, that's not actually a hadith. That's actually a statement of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, right? So, more likely than not, there's not a single hadith which says do not write hadith, right? But nonetheless, even if we entertain the opinion that, okay, it's a hadith of Rasulullah alayhi salam, it's very easy to explain, right? Very easy to explain. Now, most of the time when people try to explain this hadith, they make a critical mistake. I mean, that's probably a bit dramatic. It's not a critical mistake. It's a, what's the right word? It's not the most accurate understanding of the hadith, let's say. Okay, so they say that the reason why this hadith was said by Rasulullah alayhi salam was because he alayhi salam did not want there to be people to confuse the writing of the Quran with the writing of hadith. Right? Because paper was very, in fact, they rarely had paper. They used to write on sort of parchments of leather, on bones, on leaves, things like that, right? Because, and we'll talk about this, but the Arabs weren't a lettered society. They weren't in the habit of writing and reading, not because they were dumb or anything. If anything, they didn't need it, right? Which I'll talk about in a sec. But so the reason why, according to this explanation, that Rasulullah ﷺ said not to write hadith was because he didn't want people to confuse it with the Quran. Right? So if you're going to write something, write only the Quran. Therefore, if you have any written document anywhere, we know it's the Quran. And hadith, just memorize it and circulate it orally, not written. Right? Does that seem like a problematic explanation to anyone? Does that present a problem to anyone? I'll just, because normally when you ask a question and instead of talk, no one answers. So I'll just assume that. So yes, it presents a slight problem. And the problem is, we know the Quran is miraculous in that there's what's called tahaddi, right? Tahaddi means it's a challenge, right? When we say the Quran is a mu'jiza, it's a miracle. What is the nature of the ijaz, of the miracle? The nature of the miracle is that the tahaddi, which is a challenge, tahaddi means challenge, that no one can produce its like, right? No one can do like ityan bi mithlihi. No one can bring its like. So the Quran is very easily distinguished from anything else. Very easily distinguished, right? So that confusion wouldn't be there. The Arabs could very easily differentiate between this is a hadith, this is the Quran, right? So that's not, but not unfortunately, but this is the main way people explain this particular hadith, right? But it's not a very good explanation for the reason I just said, right? The Quran is very unique, extremely unique in the way it's written, right? Someone who knows Arabic can easily differentiate that this is the word of Allah, this is the word of an Arab poet, this is a hadith, this is a statement of a Sahabi, etc. Weren't 87% of the Arabic in hadith different to the Arabic in the Quran? That's a very specific number. Potentially, I haven't come across that specific number, but it depends what you mean, I guess, because do you mean in terms of like sentence structures, grammar, expression, vocabulary? But yeah, there's actually a very, very fascinating PhD thesis. This is a bit of a tangent. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm infamous for going into tangents, right? But I tried to refrain. I've done a good job so far, but I'm going to go on this one tangent right now, right? Because when I go on tangents and I come back, I forget what I was talking about. So I'm just going to write a little note here as a prompt. Explanation of the hadith. The right explanation of the hadith. Okay, so now I'm going to go on my tangent, all right? Now, what we know about language is that people generally, they have a confined series of expressions, grammatical structures, vocabulary, choice of words, methods of articulation. They have a defined, confined, limited way they can do that, right? You can only express meaning in ways that you yourself have understood and experienced meaning, right? So in a way, in a sense, you can document people. It's possible to document mine, yours, anyone's method and mannerisms of speaking, right? If I use a particular word, it's because it's in my recall memory. It's because I've interacted with that word. That word has given me information, has articulated meaning in real life, in expressing reality, and I've engaged with that meaning such that I can actually express that meaning myself when I come across it, right? So there's a finite number of ways that I can express meaning, right? That's why, for example, when you struggle to articulate an idea, a very complex idea or something you experience, you can't do it. It's because either you don't have the actual structure, the grammatical structure to express thought at that level, because you've never done that before, or because you don't have the word, right, to do so. So it's possible to map almost how people talk, right? Now, there was a fascinating PhD thesis done, which looked at how Rasulullah ﷺ spoke and how the Quran speaks. And the conclusion, by objective standards of linguistic sort of analysis, the author proved that it's two different speakers, right? It is two different, entirely different speakers, talking, right? Hadith versus the Quran, or Hadith and the Quran, it's two different entities talking. By every sort of socio-linguistic standard we have, and socio-linguistic tool of analysis we have, is two separate, distinct speakers talking. Right? That's what that particular thesis proved. Right? So, and this is the case just by sort of academic tools. This isn't even like someone who knows the language and they read it and it reads as two different sort of people speaking, two different pieces of work, right? So that's a tangent. Anyway, coming back to my point, which was the right explanation of the hadith. So what's the right explanation of the hadith? There's a bunch of things, right? Number one, I mentioned earlier, Allah, would it be possible to give the title? Yeah, I'll produce that for you guys, inshallah. So Allah had given the Arabs phenomenal memory, right? Like what we call photographic. I mean, there's no such thing as a photographic memory. It's called an eidetic memory, which is a part of your brain which its capacity to forget is kind of compromised, so it just retains everything, right? So the Arabs had a lot of that, right? And the reason for that is because Arabic is such a huge language in terms of vocab. It's got tens of millions of words in it, right? So like one word might have 600-700 synonyms, right? The word, for example, milk has about, I think it was 700 synonyms, right? In fact, Sheikh Musa al-Bazi, one of the scholars of the last, he died about 20 years ago. He wrote a whole book, a scholar from the subcontinent. He wrote a whole book collecting synonyms for the word milk. Sheikh Musa al-Bazi wrote a book collecting the synonyms for the word sword, and he got to 700. Imam al-Suyuti wrote a book collecting the synonyms for the word milk, and it was like a couple hundred, right? There were a couple hundred. Basically, anything the Arabs liked, they gave it many names, right? So anything the Arabs liked had like 600 different words for it, right? So there's like 700 different words for describing a lion, right? There's 600 words for describing a sword, a couple hundred for milk, a couple hundred for alcohol, a couple hundred for like all these sorts of things, right? So the Arabs in that sort of society, you're growing up and you're not memorizing 10, 15, 20,000 words. You're memorizing millions, or like, let's say hundreds of thousands, right? And that naturally is exerting a lot more pressure on the mind, a lot more attention and focus on memory, right? So the Arabs had extremely good memories. On top of that, there are a bunch of bored Arabs in the desert, right? What are you going to do in the desert, right? They're not particularly advanced civilizations with thriving industries in steel, in warfare, in markets, in trade, in civilization, in architecture, like for example, Roman Persia, right? They're relatively simplistic Arabs living in the desert, primarily concerned around survival. What sort of culture would develop here in that kind of a context, right? It wasn't sciences and maths and architecture and engineering and war and combat. It was primarily the only thing really they have is language, right? Hence their fascination to poetry, right? They were phenomenal poets. So a lot of poetry was what gave rise to so many different words, but also they would memorize poetry. Poetry was their bread and butter, right? They would exchange poetry, they would compose poetry. Basically, you would express any out of the ordinary event in the form of poetry, right? If something great happened, you came across some new wealth, or you got married, or you had your first kid, or something like that, you would articulate that through poetry. It'd be poetry was then the equivalent of Facebook statuses today, pretty much, right? You'd come up with some epic poem and you put that into circulation. And if the Arabs liked it, they'd circulate it, right? So given such an intense focus on poetry, they start to memorize these poems as well, right? And also they were a very tribalistic society, and that preserving the legacy of your tribe and the history of your tribe required memorizing entire family trees. Now, so they're very attuned to the idea of chains. They would know their chains and their forefathers and the entire sort of the family tree for centuries on end. In fact, they memorized the family trees of their animals, right? Even, right? That's how interested they were in these kinds of things. So Allah had given them extraordinary memories, right? Extraordinary capacity to memorize. That meant that they didn't write because they didn't know how to write. They didn't write because they didn't need to write. right? If we had photographic memories, we wouldn't need to write things down. I wouldn't need like a phone book if I just memorized everyone's number. Right? I wouldn't need to, so they didn't write because it was a waste of time almost. It's already in their head, right? So they didn't need to write. And I'll come to some specific examples of this soon, right? So so coming back to the question I was answering, why did Rasulullah allegedly say, don't write anything for me apart from the Quran? It was because fear of distraction from the Quran. In the early time, Rasulullah was trying to imbue a sense of identity and resonance with the Quran, so that the Quran echoes the message of the Quran, the effect of the Quran echoes throughout the consciousness of the Muslim and non-Muslim Arab society, right? Because Rasulullah is provoking thought. He's disrupting patterns. He's disrupting nonsensical cultural practices the Arabs have inherited, right? Without questioning, he's disrupting all these things. He's invoking thought, and one of the best ways to do that is to circulate the Quran and proliferate the Quran throughout society, right? Second, he didn't want written records of the Hadith and things like that to fall into the hands of people like the Munafiqeen, people like people trying to destroy Islam, things like that, right? There's information sensitivity, right? If I have a particular message to the Sahabah, that carries religious predictability. It's got a predictive capacity. If I know, for example, Rasulullah said X, right? He commanded Muslims to do X. X results in ABC, for example, things that people could do. That information has tactical value. Now, if Rasulullah says, we're going to pray in the masjid, for example, right? This example, right? That gives me, as someone who is trying to destroy Islam, predictive capacity, right? Tactical and strategic information. I know Muslims congregate here. If I want to carry out an attack, if I want to look for someone, if I want to look for Rasulullah himself, where can I find him? Boom, this hadith tells me to go to the masjid or whatever, right? So he didn't want, in that sensitive, delicate, difficult, turmoil time, for there to be written records of things of that nature. The other major reason was Islam has a very deep focus on acquiring knowledge from people, right? Ilm, Islamic knowledge, the purpose of knowledge is not an accumulation of information. It's meant to be for the output of action, right? So the person communicating knowledge is as important as the knowledge itself. That's why we don't take knowledge from fusaq. Fusaq are like fisq is like open sin, openly sinful people, right? Or open heretics and deviants and whatnot. We don't take knowledge from them, because the person transmitting knowledge is as important as the knowledge itself. And Islam has always had a very deep focus in taking knowledge from people, right? Not just in just books and stuff like that. And a whole bunch, I mean, there's like 18 different reasons why, but those are some of the main ones, right? So that's how we explain the hadith, okay? Now, coming back to our narrative as to how hadith was preserved. So let me just recap a bit so we don't lose track here. We're on Talaqi or riwayah, which means receiving hadith and transmitting hadith, right? And we just dealt with the Orientalist criticism of hadith was preserved, or we kind of dealt with it. The rest is coming. Hadith was preserved 200 years later. And the hadith itself says not to write hadith. And there's a wrong way of explaining the hadith and the right way of explaining that hadith. But the wrong way is that Rasulullah feed the mixing up of the Quran with the Sunnah, right? And that's not a valid feed, right? Because the Arabs and people even now can differentiate, because it's clearly two different people speaking, right? But the right reason why that hadith was said was all of the above. Now I'm going to look at the question of what did the Sahaba write hadith in the time of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, right? Did the Sahaba write hadith? The answer is yes. Yes, they wrote hadith extensively. All right, now, this is something we probably all know. Who is the one who has narrated the most amount of hadith in Islam? I'm actually going to wait for someone to write this while I drink the No, the one who narrated most amount of hadith. But Ibn Abbas is one of them, but he's not the top. Nope, close. Abu Hurairah, correct. Yeah. So there's an idea called the Sab'atul Mukthirat, right? The 7 who narrated more than 1,000 hadith, right? All of those are in there. Ibn Abbas, Aisha, Abu Hurairah, radiallahu anhum. They're all in there. But the one who narrated the most amount of hadith is Abu Hurairah. Did you guys know that there was someone who actually documented more hadith than Abu Hurairah, radiallahu anhu? No, there's someone who narrated more. It was Abdullah bin Amr. So Abu Hurairah himself in the Hadith of Bukhari says that no one took more hadith from Rasulullah alayhi wasallam than me except Abdullah bin Amr, because he used to write hadith. Right? Now Abu Hurairah has, radiallahu anhu, upwards of 4,000 hadith. And he's saying that someone wrote more hadith than him. So you can only imagine how many Abdullah bin Amr had. Unfortunately, Abdullah bin Amr, he didn't narrate as many as he had because he was a very, very pious individual, right? In fact, when he got married, on his wedding night, he basically, the next morning, his wife went and complained and said that, he just kept praying the whole night, right? Like, who have you married me off onto? And then Rasulullah told him to sort of like, take it easy, This dunya has a right on you as well. So he's a very pious individual. Most of his time went in ibadah. He was less occupied in narrating of hadith and more occupied in ibadah. Right? So Abdullah bin Amr, he used to write hadith, which shows you what? What does that show you? It shows you that the Sahabah were writing hadith in the time of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. Right? And Abdullah bin Amr, he said, nothing gives me hope for this life except 2 things, as-sadiqa and al-wahd. Right? This is in Sunan al-Darimi. As-sadiqa, he explained, as-sadiqa is a book which I have prepared, from which I heard directly from Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. And al-wahd is a piece of land that his father gave in charity. Right? So what does that show you? It shows you that there was writing in the time of Rasulullah alayhi wasallam. Abu Hurairah himself actually wrote hadith as well, unknown to most people. Ibn Hajar in Fath al-Bari mentions that Abu Hurairah took Hassan bin Amr to his house and showed him a book and said, see, these are all the hadith I have written down. Right? So even Abu Hurairah himself, radiallahu anhu, wrote hadith. And likewise, there's a whole bunch of different anecdotes here. The son of Ibn Mas'ud also said, these are the hadith that my father Ibn Mas'ud wrote down from Rasulullah alayhi salam, etc. Right? In fact, Abdul Rashid al-Nu'mani, one of the great scholars of the subcontinent, died. He passed away about 30, 40 years ago. One of the leading students of Anwar Shah Kashmiri, who was basically considered the Imam of his time. He wrote a book called Tarikhu Tadwin al-Hadith. That's largely from whom when I studied the subject of preservation of hadith, is basically his book that I primarily relied on. Most of what I mentioned today, by the way, is from his book. So anyway, in his book on page 48, he basically says that if we were to collect all of this hadith and the writings of the Sahabah, which were written in the time of Rasulullah alayhi salam, it would be a whole massive book, right? So we had a lot of Sahaba writing down a hadith in the time of Rasulullah alayhi salam. Right? Nonetheless, in spite of so much being written down, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the Arabs having profound memories, the Arab society and the early Muslim society being a primarily oral tradition, academic tradition. Most of the ahadith which were circulated and taught was done so orally, right? Meaning by dictation, right? Because there wasn't too much of a reliance on, if you've got a memory, which is basically it's basically a Zoom meeting which just constantly records your entire life, right? You're just recording everything, right? And you can retrieve it whenever you want. You don't need to, like if every single one of you, for example, memorized everything I said and never forgot it, we wouldn't need recordings, right? That was basically the memories. So the need for writing was a novelty, right? So vast majority of hadith which were transmitted were done so orally because the Arab society and the Sahabah didn't really have a need for memory, for writing down things. So vast majority of hadith, basically what would happen is, for example, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu would go to the masjid, he'd prepare some hadith and he'd start narrating them and dictating them. And the people would receive them, understand them, ask their questions, go back home, come back the next day and do it all over again. Right? That's roughly how it happened. This was the case for about the early period, right? Let's say the first 30 or 40 years, right? In fact, I'll give you one example. I'll give you one example of the memory, for example. Abu Hurairah, right? One of the most important transmitters of hadith in Islam, probably the most. In fact, the most, according to Dhahabi. He's the Hafid of the Ummah, he says, the memorizer of the Ummah. So Marwan was a little bit, not skeptical, but intrigued by Abu Hurairah's faculty of memorization, right? So what he did was he got one of his slaves, Abu Za'za, so he invited Abu Hurairah to his palace or whatever it was, right? His office or whatever, right? He invited Abu Hurairah to his house. Let's just say his house, right? And there was a curtain, right? And behind the curtain, he had Abu Za'za, who also had one of these photographic memories. So he said to Abu Za'za, okay, you hide behind the curtain so Abu Hurairah doesn't see you. When Abu Hurairah comes and starts dictating hadith, memorize it and write it down, right? So he invited Abu Hurairah to his house. He said, oh, Abu Hurairah, I'm very intrigued by the hadith you've been narrating. Can you tell me some of them, right? Tell me some hadith. I just want to hear from your mouth directly, right? Abu Hurairah thinking, he just wants to know some hadith. The early scholars are very interested in verifying things, hearing it from first-hand sources. Why not, right? So he dictates to him about 400 hadith, right? And Marwan's like, oh, wow, mashallah, this is amazing, blah, blah, blah. And Abu Za'za is quietly just writing them all down, right? And then Marwan says, okay, thank you, Abu Hurairah, much appreciated. You can go now, right? Now Abu Hurairah takes off, does his, goes back to his sort of what he was doing. 1 year later, right? Literally 1 year later, he goes back to Abu Hurairah and he says, Ya Abu Hurairah, all the hadith you narrated to me, I lost them. Right? I've had them on a scroll, I've lost them. My apologies. Can you tell me them again? So Abu Hurairah comes back 1 year later and he dictates those same hadith that he dictated that day all over again, right? And then Marwan says, thank you, much appreciated, appreciate your time. You can go now. And he does the same thing. So that's the second time Abu Za'za was also recording. Then when Abu Hurairah is gone, they take both scrolls, right? They're both parchments and they compare them and not a single hadith was mentioned the second year. That was the first. In fact, not only that, but the order was the same as well. The exact same order Abu Hurairah remembered to narrate those 400 hadith in. Right? This was the capacity of Abu Hurairah, right? So that's an example of the Sahaba and the memories. In fact, another one, just a quick one. Ibn Abbas, he memorized the poem of Umar ibn Abi Rabi'a, right? Which is, this poem, it's about, if you put it on a Word document today, it'd be about 4 pages, which is about 2,000 words, right? He heard it once in his entire life. He heard it exactly once. He memorized it forever, right? It's like me reading a 4-page essay in English to you, and just once, and then you memorize it forever. Right? These were the kinds of memories that they had. Right? So, given that sort of context, I hope you guys can appreciate that the need for writing wasn't that profound. Right? It was a waste of time, if anything. Right? So this was the case for the early part of Islam. Imam Sakhawi, one of the greatest scholars of hadith in our classical tradition, he says, actually, let me pause here. Anyone have any questions? Because I'm about to change stages now. So if anyone has questions, now is the time to ask. Nope. Okay, cool. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to. Yeah, so could you explain why the companions wrote in spite of the Prophet's prohibition? Good question. Sorry, I forgot to actually explain why they wrote. Anyway, the more likely answer is that the Prophet he didn't actually. Remember, I said Bukhari's opinion was that it's not actually a hadith. That's the more likely opinion. That's the more likely incident, right? That it wasn't actually Rasulullah that said that. It was Abu Sa'id al-Khudri telling that to a bunch of people after. That's the more likely explanation. Even if it was a hadith, what we believe is that initially, in the early stages of the Quran being revealed, Rasulullah told people he wanted people to focus on the Quran more than hadith, right? And that's why later on, when the people were familiar with the Quran, they memorized ayat and surah, and they're well attuned to the Quran. You know, more significant chunks of the Quran have been revealed. It's had the impact, the social impact, disruptive social impact that Rasulullah was trying to achieve. Then the prohibition was lifted. That's one explanation. The second explanation is that was a general rule to general people. When specific people sought permission, they were granted it. Right? So, like any leader, a leader has to deal with aggregates, with amalgams, with generalities, right? You can't because society is mixed up with so many different types of people. So that was the general advice to general people, but then he had specific people that he's charged with particular responsibilities, right? He might say to Abdullah bin Amr, I need you to write things down. Later on, when people can focus on hadith now, I need you to start keeping track of these things so people can benefit, things like that, right? So there was a general rule and then specific exceptions. That's the second explanation. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. So Sakhawi said, after the first century after Hijrah, there were barely any weak narrators, except for the explicitly deceptive and deceiving people like Harith, A'war, or Mukhtar Kadhab, and others. Right? In the early period, there appeared larger group of weak narrators due to their incapacity to memorize and retain hadith with greater precision. All right, so a couple of things to keep in mind. The early period, one, they had extreme memories, right? Really good memories. They were so they didn't forget, they didn't make mistakes. They knew exactly what was a hadith and what was a saying of a Sahabi or someone else. They were very pious, right? Very, very pious people. So they would not ever dream of fabricating a hadith. Right? They were very scrupulous people as well. They had paid a lot of attention to verifying things. So there wasn't a need to verify things at the moment, right? And most importantly, if someone claimed the Sahaba were the major reference points, right? Because if you had a question, you'd go to a Sahabi. If you wanted to know what the hadith says about something, you'd go to a Sahabi. If you wanted to know if something's true, you'd go to a Sahabi. So the Sahaba were the reference point for society. Just like, for example, the ulama are reference points for us today, right? So given that was the case, the scope and the domain for lying and for mistakes was very small, right? Very, very small. So the idea of lying about Rasulullah had not yet emerged, had not yet surfaced, right? Now, this changed. So that trend I just mentioned, the phenomenal memories of scholars, the piety, the Sahaba being the major reference points, the general piety of people in not even wanting to lie, the general scrupulousness of people, the rigorousness of people. All these things was true for about, let's say, the first half of the century, right? First 50 years. After, right, a number of things, a number of cataclysmic events took place, right? Namely, political issues began to surface, right? There was the famous battle between Ali and Muawiyah, radiallahu anhuma, right? So there were different political factions appearing, competing for power, right? Which created a chink in the armor for people to start fabricating a hadith, right? Because there were genuine hadith where Rasulullah ﷺ said about particular people that so-and-so will fight so-and-so and so-and-so will be in the wrong, right? He said to, for example, Aisha, "Oh Aisha, what will be your case when you see the barking dogs of Hawab," right? And then the people on the side of Ali would use these hadith. They'd say, "Oh, Rasulullah said this. You shouldn't be fighting us, right? Look at this hadith, right?" So in response, the side of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, they were like, "Oh, how do we win back some of this support? You know, okay, let's start fabricating a hadith." Well, we're not talking about Sahabah. We're not talking about, because there's major Sahabah on both sides. We're talking about some of the normal Muslims, right? They started fabricating a hadith, right? So these political contests, they led to an opening, an incentive to start fabricating hadith, to start generating support, right? Even if the Sahaba were very, very strict on this, right? Both Muawiyah and Ali and Aisha and all the other Sahaba involved were very strict and very sincere in taking the advice of Rasulullah alayhi salam. They would never dream of fabricating a hadith, right? But the lower sort of tier, like the lower tier troops and soldiers and these guys, you know, they would start to propagate their political position and premise it on fabricated hadith, which they concocted themselves. Deviant sects appeared, right? The Mu'tazila appeared in the circles of Hasan al-Basri, right? The Rafida, right? All the support for Ali radiallahu anhu was converted into theology, right? So the Rafida appeared. The Khawarij, the other side of Ali radiallahu anhu, the one who broke off from Ali's army and made takfir on him, right? So another deviant sect appeared. After Mu'tazila, the Qadriya appeared, who denied free will, right? So all these deviant sects started popping up, right? And these sects, they were obviously not as pious as the previous generations. And they had very strong, very charged theological beliefs. And they started to support and reinforce their false theological beliefs with fabricated hadith. So if you're Khariji and you're making takfir on Ali radiallahu anhu, then you would start to fabricate a hadith about this, right? If you're Rafidi and you have support for Ali radiallahu anhu, you start fabricating a hadith about this, right? So theological contests within Islam gave rise to numerous incentives and motives to start fabricating a hadith. The influence of dunya, right? As piety decreased, people were less concerned about the consequences of fabricating a hadith. It's a very serious sin, right? Al-Laknawi says it's min akbar al-kaba'ir. It's from the worst of the major sins. Some scholars even said it's kufr. To fabricate a hadith deliberately, muta'ammidan, it's kufr. Some scholars have said this, like Juwayni and others, right? But the less you care about Islam, the less you care about the consequences of that, right? In fact, there was one trader, he used to sell cookies, right? Cookies is very old, by the way. It's not modernity that produced the idea of cookies. So he used to sell cookies, and he found that, you know, people weren't buying his cookies. So he fabricated a hadith. He fabricated a hadith that he said that whoever eats cookies, it will straighten his back, right? All these ridiculous, absurd things people started fabricating. So because they were incentivized by money, etc. Right? There's a whole bunch of reasons why people started fabricating a hadith. So at that point, the idea for the first time in the Ummah to verify narrations hit. Right? So Ibn Sirin, Imam Muslim mentions this in the Muqaddimah to his Sahih, in the introduction to his Sahih, he quotes Muhammad ibn Sirin, who said, the early generations of Islam, of Muslims, they didn't used to ask, where did you get this hadith from? Because people didn't lie. People were pious. People were scrupulous. People were critical. People would not lie, right? And then he said, but when Ahlul Bid'ah and Hawa, when deviation and Bid'ah came, we started to say, Sammu lana rijalakum. Name for us your men, right? Meaning, where did you hear this hadith from? You're telling me that Rasulullah said, eat this cookie because it will straighten my back. Who did you hear that from? And he'll say, oh yeah, I heard this from this person. And then he'll go to that person. He goes, did you say that? You say, no, I didn't say that. And this guy selling cookies is a fabricator, right? So this idea, Sammu lana rijalakum, right? Name for me your men. If I heard a hadith from you, first thing I'd say is, tell me your name, tell me the person you heard this from, right? That idea popped up, right? And so the science of jarh and ta'deel was born, right? The science of asma' wa rijal was born. Names of narrators, right? Now, at the same time, the Sahabah, the Battle of Siffin, many Sahaba passed away in this battle. A number of tyrants arose as well. Hajjaj bin Yusuf, the early Umayyi Khulafa, very tyrannical people. They killed and attacked numerous Sahaba. So Sahaba started passing away. And a very pious, the first reviver of Islam, Umar bin Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah, he saw this happening, and he was a scholar himself, and he was a hadith narrator himself, and he became really worried, right? So he became really worried, and he said, okay, I need to do something about this, right? The people of piety are decreasing. People of more and more fabrications are starting to come out. So I need to do something about this, right? So he basically issued a command. He was a Khalifa, right? He's got absolute power to sort of preserve and administrate institutions as he wants. So he mentioned, so Abu Nu'aym in his Tarikh al-Isfahan, he said that Umar bin Abdul Aziz said, I wrote to the four corners of the Islamic Empire, ordering the search and compilation of Hadith. Right, so he wrote to all of the territories under his control, and he said, so he wrote to Syria, to Egypt, to Medina. I mean, he was in Medina himself, to all the different sort of regions in his command. And he said, to the governor, he said, I need you to charge your scholars by going around collecting all the hadith and putting it into one book. Right? Start documenting. Don't rely on memorization and oral transmission. Right? So this is the formal transition, the turning point from a memory-based oral tradition to a written tradition. He's commanding the documentation of hadith. He's commanding the tadween of hadith, right? So Abu Bakr ibn Hazm, for example, the Qadi and the governor of Medina, he was specifically instructed, he said, write knowledge. For I fear the loss of knowledge and the death of the ulama, right? So Ibn Hazm was a great scholar. He went around writing a whole bunch of books, right? And so we saw a great number of hadith books popping up in this period, right? So now we're leaving the stage of talaqqi wa riwayah. We're entering the stage al-marhalatu thaniya, tadween al-hadith, right? The second stage, right? In the first century, right? The latter half of the first century, right? This is what we're talking about now. The tadween of hadith. So what we saw a number of scholars rise to the occasion and start producing books, right, of hadith. So we had, for example, Ibn Hazm wrote his book. Al-Makhul, famous scholar, wrote his book of hadith. He was in Damascus. Az-Zuhri, famous Madani scholar of hadith, right, very, very famous narrator. He wrote his book collecting hadith. Shu'bah wrote his book collecting a number of hadith. Hamman ibn Munabbih wrote his Sahifa, right? Sahifa, which collected about 114, depends on the narration of that particular book. There's about 114 hadith in there, right? And in that we have with us today, even the manuscript. Right? Even the manuscript of that book we have today. It's in Berlin Library. And Imam Ahmad also records it in his Musnad. He's got that whole book has been absorbed by the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, right? Bashir ibn Nuhayq, he wrote everything from Abu Hurairah into a book that he took from him directly, right? Sa'id bin Jubair, everything he took from Ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhu, he wrote in his a book as well. Right? Similarly, for the Hanafis amongst us, Abu Hanifa wrote his book Kitab al-Athar as well. right? So this stage, in fact, Ma'mar, one of the very famous narrators of Yemen, right? The teacher of another narrator and compiler of Hadith, Abdul Razak al-San'ani, right? Ma'mar bin Rashid. He authored so many books that they were transported on camels, right? He couldn't, when he traveled to different cities, he couldn't carry them. He'd have to have like a camel filled with books following him because he couldn't carry them, right? So this command basically set in motion the idea of documenting and writing hadith, okay? And it wasn't just hadith, right? It wasn't just hadith. Keep this in mind. It was in Umar bin Abdul Aziz's initial command. He said, don't just write hadith. He specifically said, write down the sayings of the Khulafa al-Rashida, right? Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali radiallahu anhum, and the other Sahaba, the senior Sahaba, right? So all of these fatwa of the Sahaba, sayings of the Sahaba, also were written down. Okay? So that set into motion this idea of documenting and writing hadith. Okay? Now I'll pause here. Any questions about that stage? Because we're at the turning point into the 3rd century now. And the 3rd stage. No questions? Could you explain? Yes, I'll come to what a Sahih Hadith means. I'll explain that at the end. Did Umar ibn Aziz issue at Tadween? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Assalamu alaikum, Suved. So did Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, did he say to gather and compile everything into books? Was that at Tadween, or was at Tadween something else?
Yes, that was Tadween, correct. That was correct, yeah. So he issued the command to document and so basically 3 things, or 2 things: collect, aggregate, and then document in written form. Right? So he's basically Tadween, you can think of it as the formal command to transition the academic trend of oral transmission of knowledge to written transmission of knowledge. He commanded that. And that marked the idea of Tadween. Any other questions? Cool. Okay. So let's get on to the 3rd stage now. So by this stage, let's fast forward about 2 or 3 decades, where writing has become the dominant practice, right? Actually, one other reason I forgot to mention was that the Islamic Khilafah, it grew so quickly, expanded so quickly, that it wasn't just Arabs anymore. And therefore, it wasn't just the Arab demographic that the Muslim population comprised of. You had Persians entering Islam, Syrians entering Islam, Egyptians, which were considered Africa at the time, entering Islam, a whole bunch of different civilizations entering Islam, which meant a whole bunch of different cultural practices, language, lack of familiarity with Arabic. Now you have a whole bunch of people learning Arabic and entering Islam that aren't actually Arabs, right? So they don't have those photographic memories I referred to earlier. They don't have that same command of the Arabic language. They have to learn it. So this cultural, I suppose, these different sort of cultural components entering into Islam and distilling what once used to be a very unified culture also was one of the reasons that caused Umar bin Abdul Aziz to reconsider the oral tradition, right? Because not everyone has a photographic memory, right? And not everyone's not everyone memorizes the genealogy of their camel and their horse, right? So they had to reconsider a lot of the ways that the Khilafah used to administrate its academia and its dissemination of knowledge. That's something that I forgot to mention. Anyways, so the third stage began. So at the point of Tadween, writing down had become the way, capital T, the way to receive knowledge and preserve it. All right, so here, this idea permeated into every science, not just hadith. Right? Quran and the qira'at began to be being documented. Tafsir, right, began to be documented. Even Arabic grammar, right? Abu Aswad al-Du'ali, for example, according to one opinion, wrote a book on Arabic grammar. And then came Al-Farahidi and As-Sibawayh and whatnot. And they started writing their Qawaid of Nahu. Fiqh itself began to be documented as well, right? Every science was developing and evolving in a written manner, not an oral manner anymore, right? So in this stage, now we came to the stage of a tasnif, right? So remember I said the analogy I gave was you have your draft essay, which is the tadween. Now you have your tasnif, which is the final product, the one that you submit to your, the one that you submit on the last night, minutes before the deadline at midnight for the tutor to assess. That's a tasnif, although the scholars were far more disciplined, let's say, right? So tasnif here, in this stage is Bukhari, Muslim, the 6 books of Hadith, the Darimi, Musnad Imam Ahmad, and the Masanid they're called, right? Musnad al-Daylami, Musnad Abi Dawood, the Musannafat of Abdul Razzaq, and Musannaf Ibn Abi Shayba. All these are from the Marhalat al-Thalitha, the third stage, which is tasnif, the written stage, right? And even in Hadith, we have the documentation of not just Hadith, not just sayings of Sahabah, but also all the sub-sciences surrounding Hadith, right? I mentioned one earlier. Who can remember what it was? I touched on it earlier. Asma' wa Rijal, right? Which was the introductory science out of which the science as we know it now, al-jarh wa ta'deel, is formed, right? Which is criticisms of narrators, which I'll come to that in a sec. Don't worry if this sounds like it's Swahili or some other language at the moment. I'll explain all these things in a sec, right? But all the corpus of hadith as well as its sub-sciences are also being documented, right? In this third stage. So Imam al-Sakhawi, sorry, not Sakhawi. So now you had formal books being written in hadith with the express purpose of not just preservation, but now dissemination, circulation of knowledge, right? So earlier, Ma'mar wrote his books for the purpose of codifying and then bringing them back and preserving in a repository, right? He didn't write it to start circulating to other people, right? In this stage, when people wrote a book, they basically, what they do is they travel all around the world. And that is its own, literally, it's a course. There are courses that I've attended. The express and exclusive focus of which was documenting and explaining the travels of the scholars and the length of travel they undertook to preserve and gather knowledge. I'll give you one very, very quick example, right? Ibn Manda, one of the great scholars of hadith, he left his house, his hometown, to travel and collect hadith at the age of 20, right? He returned he finished his travels and returned home at the age of 60. He's traveling around for 40 years, around all different parts of the Khilafah at the time, just going scholar after scholar and writing things down. And he brings all that information back, and then he starts to synthesize it and compile it, right? And document it and refine it. And then once he's got his refined essay that he wants to submit, he sits down and starts communicating, right? Bukhari did the same thing. He went all around, everywhere, right? All different countries, gathered 300,000 hadith right? 300,000 ahadith with the chains from all different places around the world, came back, wrote his Sahih, and then he said, okay, now I'm going to narrate to my students Sahih Bukhari. Right? And then his students take that book from him, and then they start to narrate it from the book, right? So that is that's basically what's happening in the stage of tasnif, right? You're going all around different places, all different scholars. You're gathering as much information as possible. Then you're bringing it back and you're synthesizing it. You're going through it. You're saying, oh, I don't like this hadith. I'm going to get rid of it. Oh, I like this hadith. I'm going to use that, right? So there's a very famous saying of Yahya ibn Ma'in, who's one of the most significant muhaddithin of the past. He said that when you gather knowledge, write everything, anything you hear. Doesn't matter if it's right, wrong, false, fabricated, authentic, mutawatir. Doesn't matter. Write it all down, right? When you transmit knowledge, do so with utmost veracity and rigor, right? So when you're collecting, collect everything. When you're transmitting, be absolutely laser sharp in your precision in what you narrate and the scrutiny with which you interrogate what you've inherited and what you've received. Okay, so that's what's happening in this century, right? You have scholars, great scholars, rising to the occasion, traveling all around the Muslim world, collecting all sorts of different narrations, bringing it back, synthesizing it, putting it into one book, and then putting that book into circulation, right? Now, the key scholars that kicked this trend off was Imam Malik in his well-known book, the Muwatta, which we have with us to this day, the Muwatta of Imam Malik, a very well-known, very widely studied book, the Muwatta. Any Darul Uloom, or not any, but vast majority of Darul Ulooms that if you graduate from, you will study the Muwatta of Imam Malik alongside the 6 books of Hadith, right? You had the Muwatta of Ibn Abi Dhi'b, right? Another Madani scholar, contemporary of Imam Malik. You had Ibn Jurayj and his Musnad. You had Sufyan bin Uyayna and Sufyan in Mecca, in his Musnad. You had Sufyan al-Thawri in Kufa and his Musnad. Musnad is a collection of Hadith, a specific type of collection of Hadith. So you had these kinds of scholars writing books and then circulating and transmitting these books, right? And this is what the 6 Imams of Hadith did as well, right? Abu Dawood, Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, and their contemporaries, Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Hibban, Abu Awana, Ibn Sakan, Ibn Sa'id ibn Mansur, all these scholars, that's what they're doing. They travel 30, 40, 50 years, hear everything they possibly can, come back, and then write it all down and then transmit that, right? So that's what's happening in this particular stage. Now, let me just go off on a little tangent here and talk about the science of Jarh and Ta'deel, because like I said in the beginning, it's very hard to talk about this without the details in terms of a protracted 6-hour course, right? So basically the 2 things I can talk about in the time that I've sort of been given is one, at the broadest possible level, how was Hadith preserved, right? So that's in terms of history, the strict events which took place and developed and the causes which led to those developments, giving rise to this multi-century effort of documenting and preserving Hadith as we have received it today, right? That part's what I've spoken about. The next this part here speaks to the science of Jarh and Ta'deel, which is to do with the criticism of how we verified what we collected, right? So I mentioned earlier, Imam Ahmad, for example, he memorized 1 million ahadith, 1 million ahadith, right? With chains and the biographies of the people in that chain. He memorized 1 million of those, right? Yahya ibn Ma'in, another scholar I made reference to, he memorized 1 million hadith, 1 million, right? A hadith. Abu Zur'at al-Razi, a great scholar, student from Imam Ahmad, memorized 700,000 hadith. Imam Bukhari himself memorized 300,000 hadith. Abu Dawood memorized 500,000 hadith, right? So the question that I want to ask now is, if Imam Bukhari memorized 300,000 hadith, why does his Sahih contain just north of 4,000 hadith without repetitions? Well, what happened to the other 296,000 hadith? Why does the Sahih of Muslim contain about 5,700 hadith without repetitions? Right? Why does Abu Dawood contain about 4,400? What happened to the other 596,000 or whatever, right? So what happened was they're collecting all this information without regard for what's authentic, what's not, right? It's just a dumping ground. It's just dumping all this information into one place, right? Then they're critiquing that. So once they finish their 40, 30-year journey of travel and amassing and aggregating knowledge, and they've come back, now they start going through and scrutinizing and critiquing and analyzing and differentiating between what is worthy and is with a base and a foundation and with validity and veracity to transmit, and what's not, right? And there's a number of different academic tools and sciences which were developed to enable this process, but the main one is probably the science of jarh wa ta'deel. Jarh means to cut, right? If I have a cut and start bleeding, that's called a jarh, right? Jurihtu, if I say jurih, it's like I was cut by something, right? You start bleeding, that's a jarh. And ta'deel is to validate, let's say, or to declare someone to be trustworthy, right? Al-jarh wa ta'deel, or tajreeh wa ta'deel. So if I make jarh on you, it means you're not a reliable narrator, or there's something wrong that I need to be cognizant of before I start taking a hadith. Conversely, if I make ta'deel on you, right, then that's saying that, yep, this guy is a good narrator, he's fine, you can take his hadith, right? So Sakhawi, that's what I'm going to speak about now. So what I've spoken about is the process as a series of historical events which took place, which gave rise to the final product, which is the hadith that we have today. On what basis was the hadith differentiated from the false narrations that were in circulation, right? And there were a lot of them. There were many, 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 many of them, right? Imam Ahmad, funny story actually, Imam Dhabi mentions this in his Siyar, A'lam al-Nubala. Imam Ahmad, he had two sons. We had more, but two main sons, right? Abdullah was his name. And he put a lot of academic training and attention and tarbiyah into this son. So he made his son memorize 1 million narrations with the chains, right? 1 million narrations. So at the end of the 1 million narrations, right? You can imagine decades have gone past, and his son's like, okay, yes, I've memorized 1 million narrations. I'm good. I'm pretty solid. And Ahmed says they're all fabricated, right? And his son's like, what? Why did you make me memorize 1 million narrations? And then Imam Ahmad says, 1 million fabrications, sorry. And Imam Ahmad says, well, it's because now you know what all the fabrications are, right? So given you know what the fabrications are, now you will know what the authentic narrations are. Right? So you know what not to take, and then conversely, you now also know what to take, right? So the science of, so what I'm going to speak about now discusses the process by which scholars synthesized the inauthentic from the authentic, right? Which was primarily through the academic vehicle and the science and the discipline of jarh wa ta'deel. So Sakhawi says, remember I mentioned earlier that that Ibn Sirin said, "Sammu lana rijalakum," right? Name for us your men, right? So people began mentally to keep track of narrators. Who are the people claiming to narrate a particular hadith? Right? So it entered the consciousness of the Muslim, of the muhaddith's mind, right? The scholar, the hadith scholar's mind, as something to be cognizant of, right? It planted the seeds which would become this particular science now. And like as sort of the science developed more and more, people began to become more and more interested in this particular science, right? So as Sakhawi says, so basically Sakhawi mentions that key scholars emerged who were intimately familiar with the biographies of scholars, right? With the names of narrators and the people that were claiming to narrate hadith and their biographies and their memory and what people have said about them, etc. Right? So some key figures: Ibn Majishun, Sufyan al-Thawri, Hamad bin Salama, Layth bin Sa'ad, al-Awza'i, al-Dastuwa'i, al-Ma'mar, and others. Now these scholars when you had a question, okay, I heard this hadith from Fulan ibn Fulan, right? What's the go with Fulan ibn Fulan? Can I take from him? I don't know. Let's go to Sufyan al-Thawri, right? So you go to Sufyan al-Thawri, you'd say, hey Sufyan, I heard this hadith from Fulan ibn Fulan. What do you think? And Sufyan al-Thawri would tell you, yeah, Fulan ibn Fulan, he's generally okay. He's not a liar, but because of his senile age, he sometimes makes mistakes. He confuses statements of Sahabah to be hadith, right? So just be careful, right? Make sure he's got like an alibi, right? Only take what he says if one of his friends also says that this is a hadith, right? Otherwise, don't really consider it a hadith, right? So if like, oh, cool, thanks, Sufyan, I'll keep that in mind, right? So you'd go to these people to find out if you were suspect about someone, if you weren't sure about someone, right? Now that effort of these scholars gave rise, that science, now that it was a reference point, now that it was a common question, you weren't just asking anymore, who did you hear this from? You weren't just asking that question anymore. You were asking, who did you hear this from? And can I take from this guy? I want to know about him, right? So if I was told a chain, I'd say Fulan ibn Fulan from, Fulan ibn Fulan from blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's look at these guys. Who are these guys? Let's look at their biography. I want to know about them. Are they reliable people? Who are they? Are they some sort of liar? Are they some Khariji? Right? Do they belong to a deviant sect? I want a profile on these narrators, that are narrating this narration. I want to know something about them, right? So out of that, what began to happen is majalis or circles of hadith, where narrators themselves are being discussed, they appeared, right? And some funny stories here. So, Shu'bah and Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan, and these scholars would have that, right? So they'd say things like, come, let us backbite for the sake of Allah today. Let us backbite for the sake of Allah. What does he mean by that? Right? That's a real statement. Shu'bah said that. Come, let us backbite for the sake of Allah. Meaning, let's discuss the narrators and their problems. Because now you're dealing with hadith. You're allowed to, there are 6 reasons according to Imam Nawawi when you can backbite. One of them is when it serves as a basis for verifying information, which is relevant to the hadith. Right? So they would say, okay, Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman, what do you guys know about him? Right? All these muhaddithin, they'd be sitting before Shu'bah, and Shu'bah would say, let's talk about Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman. Right? What do you know about him? Here's what I know. He's reliable. He's pious. I've seen him pray all night in tahajjud. This is what his neighbors said about him. This is what his parents said about him. This is what his teachers said about him. What do you know? And someone else in the audience might say, oh, you know what? He claimed to be narrating this hadith. I went back to his sheikh and I asked him, does Muhammad ibn Abdul Rahman narrate this hadith? His sheikh said, no, he doesn't write this hadith. So then Shu'bah was like, oh, that's a problem. Why is that happening? Right? And then so there's intimate discussions going around the specifics of people. Right? For hours on end. Sometimes they debate and discuss narrators for hours on end. Right? And at the end, they'd come up with a grading. They'd say, okay, let's say 6 hours of discussion, the narrator goes by. They'd say, okay, sure, I would say, okay, based on all of what I've heard from you guys and my own expertise, according to me, Muhammad ibn Rahman is reliable, except when he narrates from XYZ person, right? Something like that, right? So these circles are appearing, which are discussing not hadith, they're discussing the narrators of hadith, right? So in that context, the science of Jarh and Ta'deel was formally born, right? And it was incepted by 2 scholars, Shu'bah and Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan, right? So they put together this systematic science in a documented manner, right? So they began to document these things. It wasn't just Sufyan al-Thawri with his photographic memory has memorized deep profiles of all these narrators just because he can, right? Or Layth ibn Sa'd, or Sufyan ibn Uyayna, right? It wasn't just like a repository, a mental repository that they've developed. It's these deep profiles that they've sort of built. Now it's being documented, right? Some of these books, they're 35 volumes. We have them to this day, right? If we had more time, I would have shown you some pictures. Tahdhib al-Kamal, for example, 35 volumes, right? Tarikh al-Dimishq, another one, written on the science of Jarh and Ta'deel, dealing only with the Damascus narrators, only the Damascene narrators, is 82 volumes. This book, printed today, 82. My teachers have this book. I've seen it with my own eyes, right? 82 volumes, dealing just, which are every narrator from Damascus and a detailed biography, right? 82 volumes. Tarikh al-Baghdad, 17 volumes, right? So we're talking about voluminous records that were sort of alphabetically documented around every single narrator, right? If you open up any of the 6 books of Hadith and you find any narrator, right? You say, Bukhari narrates from Ya'la bin Ubayd, somewhere in the chain. I take that name, Ya'la bin Ubayd. I go back to the Hadith al-Kamal, I'll find a detailed biography spanning pages, where he was born, where he traveled, what year he did Hajj, what year he traveled, what year he got married, who his teachers were, who his students were, right? The year in which he traveled, how long he spent, where he traveled. If he went to Egypt in a particular year, how long did he spend there? When did he travel to Damascus? How long did he spend there? What was his profession? What did his teacher say about him? What did his spouse say about him? What did his family say about him? What did his friends say about him? What did the people in the masjid say about him? Did he used to go to the masjid? Right? What did he look like? Even things like how long was his beard? Right? Did he carry a miswak in his pocket? Did he carry a pen in his pocket? How long were his sleeves? These are real examples. I'm making this up. These are real things. They documented, right? Details. In fact, another funny story. Yahya bin Ma'in was the imam of this ummah in Jarh and Ta'deel. His full-time job was to go around and interview everyone who knew someone claiming to narrate hadith. He'd just go all around the Muslim world, right? He'd go, this particular narrator, Ibn Lahi'a, is claiming to narrate hadith. Let's say your sibling was a narrator of hadith. Yahya bin Ma'in would come knock on your door. He'd say, hey, I'm Yahya bin Ma'in. My job is to find out everything your sibling, who claims to be a narrator of hadith, everything about him. Tell me about this. When was he born? Does he pray? Does he pray in the masjid? Right? Ibn Mubarak, he said that if you were seen not praying in the masjid, your hadith will be rejected. Right? If you weren't known to be someone who prays in the masjid, your hadith are not acceptable. Right? These are the standards of the people. These are the expectations for those people claiming to narrate hadith. Right? So Yahya bin Ma'in would go and ask about these things. And he'd ask so many questions that people would say, you're asking me so many questions about him, it's as though you want to marry the guy. Right? And Yahya bin Ma'in would say, we interrogate people that claim to narrate hadith more than you guys interrogate people when you want to marry them. Right? So if you're interested in a particular person for marriage, the amount of questions and the processes by which you get to know them to determine whether or not they're a valid sort of match for you, the muhaddithin, the scholars of Jarh and Ta'deel, they expended more effort in getting to know the narrators. And with that intimate knowledge, they'd say, okay, this particular narrator, I'm going to take from him, or don't take from him, right? Or conditionally take from him. Take from him only between this age and this age. Because when he turned 55, his memory weakened, he began making mistakes. The rate of his mistakes increased by 30%, he's no longer reliable. Or only take from him when he narrates from Egyptians, and don't take from him when he narrates from Syrians, for whatever reason, right? Or only narrate from him between this age and that age, because at this particular time, his library burnt down, he began relying on his memory, he no longer had books in front of him, and he began making mistakes, right? All these kinds of things. Right? So they had detailed biographies that were formed. And this is basically the primary thing going on, parallel to scholars, the tasnif period, parallel to the scholars compiling narrations and books of hadith to circulate. This is the science that's developing parallel to that, parallel effort, the science of Jarh and Ta'deel. So you saw many books in this period come out, like Al-Kamil of Ibn Adi, which is about 12 volumes. One of my teachers, Dr. Isam Eidu, he recommends everyone to read this book, and he reads it every year. Phenomenal book, right? You had Bukhari's book himself, At-Tarikh al-Kabir, right? A very phenomenal, I think it's about 12 volumes, where he documents a whole bunch of narrators in this particular book. And in fact, every time he would put a narrator with the analysis on that narrator into this book, he'd do ghusl, he'd pray 2 rak'ah, ask Allah for hidayah, and then put him in there. And when he would write the book, he'd sit in the Masjid al-Nabawi, in between the maqam of Rasulullah and his grave, in between for barakah. And he'd write that book at the light after Isha on a moonlit night when the barakah is most, he'd write it then. Right? That's the kind of spiritual effort, spiritually conducive effort they put into their works. And that's why we have that book today. How does a 12-volume book in manuscripts survive 1,200 years in spite of what the Ummah has gone through? Right? It's because of the barakah that Allah put into these people's books. So these kinds of things in Jarh and Ta'deel is also taking place. Right? And we have a lot of their books. The Tarikh of Yahya bin Ma'in has survived. Tarikh al-Damishq of Abu Zur'at al-Razi has survived. Al-Jarh wa Ta'deel of Ibn Abi Hatim, it's about 10 volumes, right? That survived. We have a whole corpus of literature. So for example, when and this is the intimacy and the detail, the level of detail with which we have the narrators, right? So I mentioned Ya'la bin Ubayd, right? The science of Jarh and Ta'deel, what happens, this is, as a practitioner, inshallah, one day you guys become practitioners of hadith, right? When it's takhrij, yes, takhrij is a separate science. Takhrij is the science, because one hadith is narrated through multiple chains, right? Before you can give a verdict on that chain, before you can say this hadith is sahih, this is da'if, this is hasan, blah, 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 you need to collect all the different ways that hadith is narrated, right? So you might have one hadith which is narrated from Ibn Abbas, which is narrated from Abu Hurairah, which is narrated from Aisha, which is narrated from Anas bin Malik, radiallahu anhum, right? All of them heard Rasulullah say that hadith, right? And then they narrate that to their students, and they narrate that to their students, and they narrate that to their students. Until eventually it ends up in Bukhari and in Muslim and in Abu Dawood and in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad and in the Sunan of Sayyid ibn Mansur. So you have 5 different chains, right? So before you can say this hadith is authentic or da'if, you need to put them all together, right? So what are the sum total number of chains and ways that this particular hadith has come? Finding that out and exhausting that, that's the science of takhrij, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, cool. So, where was that? Yeah, sorry, so here's what the life looks like of an everyday practitioner in the science of Jarh and Ta'deel, right? You might come across a narrator, Ya'la bin Ubayd, right? I already gave an example. Let's say Amr bin Dinar, right? You see him in a chain, right? It's absolute nightmare when you first start. It's very difficult, right? You come across Amr bin Dinar. You say, okay, let's look at who's this guy? Who's this Amr bin Dinar bloke, right? You open up the books of Jarh and Ta'deel, right? You go to Tahdhib al-Kamal, you go to Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, you go to Al-Mizan al-I'tidal, you go to Al-Du'afa, whatever, right? Any book, and it's all these kinds of books. It's an absolute rat's nest of different scholarly commentary, right? You will see so many scholars were active here. You see Ibn Adi said he's thiqa. You see Ibn Hibban said he's majhul. You see Yahya bin Ma'in said he's la ba'sa bihi. You see Nasa'i said laysa biqawi. You see Abu Hatim said this. Abu Zur'a said this. Each of whom had extensive experience. All right, so now you look at their reasons. You say, okay, why did Abu Zur'a al-Razi say he's da'if? Oh, okay, Abu Zur'a was strict. He took a stricter approach, right? In fact, some scholars were so strict. This is a real, I'm not even joking, this is a real scenario. One scholar, Shu'bah, heard the sound of a tambourine coming from the general direction of someone's house, and he said, you know what? I'm not going to take his hadith. Not even from the guy's house, just in the general direction. He was like, no, da'if. Right? But he was like super strict. So if Shu'bah says someone is weak, we're going to be like, oh, okay, hang on. You're a very strict guy. We need a second opinion here. Let's look at what some not so strict people said, right? So you look at Amr bin Dinar, you see a whole bunch of different people commenting on him, right? And then you start to look at why, what's the reason behind their commentary and their grading, right? And then you say, okay, you know what? Probably the best position is X, Y, Z. And we have scholars like Ibn Hajar and Al-Dhahabi and Al-Mizzi is the big name to sort of revert to in that sort of instance. So that was the science of Jarh and Ta'deel. Okay, there's a lot more I could talk about, but time is running out. There's only 10 minutes left. But basically, that's what happened, right? So scholars went from tribe to tribe, village to village, personally meeting narrators, testing them, right? Testing them to see, is this guy reliable or not, right? Imam Malik, when Imam Malik went to see if Ayyub al-Sakhtiyani is a reliable narrator, he went, kind of hid himself and just observed Ayyub al-Sakhtiyani for days, right? And he noticed that every time Rasulullah ﷺ was mentioned, Ayyub al-Sakhtiyani would start to get teary, right? Because he was his love and awe of Rasulullah ﷺ. And after days of observation, he said, okay, now I'm satisfied. Ayyub al-Sakhtiyani is a pious religious guy, right? So they would go to narrators and they'd say, you claimed 4 years ago to narrate these hadith to this group of people. Narrate those hadith to me right now. And this narrator who's doing this testing will have those hadith, right? And that scholar will say, okay, give me 1 sec, let me get that book. He'll go get the book, open it up, and go, okay, and he starts. He starts narrating the hadith, and the scholar examining him is like, yep. Oh, that's a mistake. You just made a mistake, right? And then we go, okay, you know what? You made 1 mistake out of 60. That's good enough for me, right? So they'll personally test the person as well. And they'll cross-examine. They'll say, okay, you claim, so where'd you hear this hadith from? You said you heard it from this guy? Okay, cool, thanks. They'll go to that teacher. They'll say, hey, this guy is claiming to narrate hadith from you. For one example of this is Sulaiman was claiming to have heard a hadith from Imam Zuhri, right? So they went to Sulaiman and they said, hey, where'd you hear this hadith from? He said, I heard it from Zuhri. Like, oh, okay, cool, Zuhri, eh? So they went to Zuhri, they said, hey, Zuhri, Sulaiman is claiming to have narrated that you narrated this hadith to him. Is this true? And Zuhri said, no. He said, Sulaiman is a reliable narrator. He stayed with me for a long time. He's pious, he's reliable. But in this particular case, it's mistaken, right? So this particular hadith, I didn't narrate it to him, right? I have narrated the hadith, but not to him, right? And the scholar, Yahya bin Ma'in or whoever, he'll be like, oh, interesting, thank you. And he'll record that in his entry in his database, in his profile of that particular narrator, right? And then once he's collected all this information, he'll come up with a summary judgment. He'll say, yep, he's a reliable narrator, except when he narrates from Zuhri, right? Etc. So this is the kind of effort the scholars undertook and expended to summarize and to produce a detailed way to verify the hadith which we have today. Okay. Questions? That's probably a lot to take in. So, any questions? Just before I start to explain what it means for a hadith to be sahih. No? When was the Jarh and Ta'dil happen again? 2nd to 3rd century. Primarily. At the level of documentation, 2nd to 3rd century. Any other questions? Cool. We'll keep them coming, and I'll just quickly explain what it means for a hadith to be sahih. So now, when we say hadith sahih, we primarily mean a hadith must meet 5 conditions to be sahih, right? Number 1, the chain must be connected, right? So from Imam Bukhari, for example, all the way back to Rasulullah alayhi wasallam, it must be a connected chain. So Rasulullah alayhi wasallam narrated it to a sahabi, he narrated to a tabi', which is the one who studied the sahabi. I'll just write it actually. So Rasulullah to a sahabi, to a tabi'. Tabi' is the one who narrated it from a sahabi. To a tabi' or tabi'i. And then that's when the names stop. To the 3rd century guy. I'll just write the 3rd century guy, a bit crude, but running out of time. 4th century guy. And that's usually when the stops, right? So Bukhari heard from one of his teachers, let's say, Imam Ahmad, who heard it from one of his teachers, right? Could be anyone, Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan or whatever, who heard it from, for example, Sufyan al-Thawri, who heard it from, who did Sufyan narrate? From Hamad bin Salama, who heard it from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, who heard it from Alqamah, who heard it from Ibn Mas'ud, who heard it from Rasulullah alayhi wasallam. That's a longer chain, right? Typically, Bukhari sometimes has 3 people between him him Rasulullah alayhi salam. Right? So every stage of the chain has to be connected. Right? If, for example, let's say the tabi' or tabi'i is missing. Right? So you go sahabi, tabi', 3rd century guy, 4th century guy. This hadith can't be sahih. There's a gap. There's an unexplained gap. It's like when you I don't know how many of you guys have applied for jobs, but if you have like a gap in your resume, employers always ask about it. They're like, oh, okay, you worked from 2017 to 2018, and then there's a gap here. Why? There's a 1 year gap. Well, explain that gap. What happened? Right? So if there's a gap in it, it's suspect. Well, what's happening here? Right? Why is there a gap? Hadith can't be sahih. Right? That's number one. That's called ittisal al-sanad. Right? Connected chain. Number 2 is the narrators themselves have to have 2 qualities: the adil and the dhabit. Right? Adil deals with piety, which looks at the question of, is this guy capable of lying? And dhabit looks at the question of reliability. All right, so just because you're pious doesn't mean you have a good memory. You could believe what you're saying is a hadith of Rasulullah alayhi salam, but that might be a mistake. You might be confused. You might have heard it a long time ago, and you're thinking it's a hadith, but it's actually a saying of someone else, a sahabi, for example, right? So how is your memory? That's what they look at as well, right? So the people in this chain, once we've established this chain is connected, right? Now we're looking at each narrator. Is the narrator, is he of upright piety, right? Or is he someone capable of lying, right? If he's someone capable of lying, disqualified. Chain's not authentic. We can't trust it, right? He has to be someone who wouldn't lie. Is this chain, is this narrator, is he accurate in what he actually transmits, right? Or does he make mistakes? Such that we can't have, even if we can have confidence that he's not lying, he might be making a mistake, and we can't accept mistakes as far as hadith are concerned. So we can't accept that from him, right? So that's dhabit. That's the 3rd condition. If this all sanad, connected chain, adil, person's a righteous person, doesn't lie. Dhabit, he's a reliable, accurate narrator, precise narrator, doesn't make mistakes. So these are the 3 conditions that a hadith must have, right? Then a hadith can't have 2 disqualifying factors, right? Which is called admu shudud wal illa. Meaning, shudud is a comparison, right? A comparative assessment. Meaning, now what happens if because everyone makes mistakes, right? No one doesn't make mistakes, right? So sometimes a hadith might fall through the cracks, right? You might have a reliable, pious person who generally doesn't make mistakes. But how do we deal with the 5% of the time that he makes a mistake? Well, what do we do here? We need a mechanism for that, right? So the guy's pious, he's very reliable. 99 hadith out of 100 he narrates will be spot on. What do we do with that 1 hadith? How do we know that's mistaken, right? So that's what shadh looks at, which is a comparison, right? So let's say 5 people narrated this hadith from the tabi'i. A tabi'i, right? 5 people narrated from the tabi'i. So what you'll do, and they're all thiqah, they're all reliable, they're all adil and dhabit, they're all reliable, right? Now what you do is you look at all 5 and you see if 4 of them are saying one thing and the 5th one is saying something else, you know this guy's probably making a mistake, right? So cross-referencing, let's say, right? Cross-referencing or peer review, to use like a university sort of scenario, peer review. So you take this thiqah, just because it's a connected chain and the guy's reliable and he's pious, we're not done yet. We need to take what he's claiming and compare it to his colleagues. Does it match, right? Or is there a discrepancy? If there's a discrepancy, we know that's the 1 time out of 100 that he's made a mistake, and we can say, okay, this is the 1 time we're not going to accept his narration, right? That's that. That's number 4. That's called shadh. And then illa is sometimes there can be a hidden defect, right? So, for example, sometimes, this is a tricky one. It probably needs a lot of time to explain, but sometimes, for example, actually, you know how I mentioned earlier, the hadith, لا تكتب عني غير القرآن, don't write for me other than the Quran. There's a debate, right? Is this a hadith or is this a saying of Abu Sa'id al-Khudri? That's an example of an illah, right? So some scholars thought that when Abu Sa'id al-Khudri said, لا تكتب عني غير القرآن. Some people thought that he is saying that Rasulullah ﷺ said that. So you have a connected chain of people that are reliable and pious, misunderstanding the content of what Abu Sa'id al-Khudri is saying, right? Thinking that it's a hadith, whereas in reality, it's a statement of a Sahabi. So that's an illah, right? So it meets all four criteria, but we have one last little safety check, right? Is there something else missing that gives us the idea, the notion that this might not be accurate, right? So sure, it's connected, check, all the narrators are reliable, check, they're all precise, check, all the colleagues are also narrating the same thing, check. But when we look at other narrations, we see it just doesn't fit the general theme, right? Why isn't anyone else narrating this command, right? Why is there, as one of the brothers mentioned, why is there so much writing going on in the time of Rasulullah? It's not fitting. It's not consistent with generally what happened. It's raising questions, right? It's sticking out. It's like a nail which is sticking out, right? Like why? There's something different here, right? What's going on? That's called an illah. Very crude, simplified explanation, but I don't have time to get technical. So these are the 5 things that it must meet. And each of these is like a whole course. It's like a 2-3 month course just on Ittisal. Ibrahim al-Lahim, for example, has written a book called Al-Ittisal wal-Inqita'. It's 2 thick volumes, just looking at that one condition, Ittisal. Right? So it's a very, very, like normally when we covered with my teachers Sahih, it took us 30 hours just to do that, what I just said. And that for him was simplified. So this is a huge topic, but that's like a quick 5-minute summary because we're out of time. Any questions around Sahih or anything else I've mentioned? That's the end, by the way, for me. So I'm done with my presentation. So any questions from anyone about anything I've mentioned?
Feel free to use your mics as well, guys, if you want to ask something.
Yep, sure. I'll write them as well. Yep, so the first one was Ittisal Sanad, which is connected chain or connectivity of chain. Adil, which is, let's say, pious. So this one looks at you're not a liar. 3 is Dabit, which is reliable or precise, which looks at or tries to exclude mistakes, pious people making mistakes. 4 is lack of shudud, which is, let's say, a comparative assessment or cross-examination. And then 5 is lack of illah, which is, let's say, a thematic inconsistency or subtle defect is the proper translation. So these are the 5. Any other questions?
SubhanAllah, guys. So basically, Sister Haja, who's the other Dawah lead, and Najifa as well, they're also writing notes. So inshallah, we'll post these simplified notes on UNSWMSA page as well. Yeah.
I'll just throw my email here as well in case anyone has questions.
Yeah, that way we can also ask if you need anything.
Yeah, if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to email me.
I guess we'll end it here. Before we end it, I just want to say, like, legit, I'm shocked as well because the hadith compiling and the spiritual exhaustion, the mental, physical exhaustion, everything, the amount of work the scholars put it up for us. And it's a mercy from Allah. We have these hadiths like just by a flick of just on Google Chrome. Search it up, 2 seconds. Yeah, and subhanAllah, they're even more reliable than the Christian sacred texts as well. And inshallah, it'll help us in the da'wah as well. Again, a big jazakallah khair for our brother Suved for sharing his immense knowledge with us, and also to the volunteers for staying and listening to this, inshallah. So yeah, if you don't have any questions, inshallah, guess we'll end it. Also a reminder to fill out the form for Unit Study students.
So we closing out?
Inshallah, yeah.
Okay.
Jazakallah khair, Suved.
وإياكم سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Assalamu alaikum.